And I want to talk a little bit about your time testing for Williams because that was kind of going on at the same time. Well, first of all, kind of help us set the scene. The 90s are often considered this golden era for technology in F1. But why is this, and what role did you have in that?
So I was probably the first generation of test driver in F1 where you actually held a contract and was on a very big test program. Did several thousand kilometers of testing with Williams, a huge amount more than what today's test driver or reserve drivers would do because there's very limited opportunity. But it was exactly that. It was a test driving role that was fundamental and functional for the team. Mainly also with a test team, so a completely independent operating Formula One team in its test configuration alongside the race guys. So I was lucky that I went to Williams and was involved in a lot of the technology and projects around then, mainly active ride suspension. And I would say I've probably done more miles, more kilometers in an active ride Formula One car than any other driver there is. And also I did most of the work with semi-automatic gearboxes, so paddle shift. Most of that stuff was done with me at the wheel of a Williams as well. So, very fortunate, very lucky to have done all that. Very fortunate to work with some great guys. Back when I was doing that, there was a guy called Patrick Lowe, who then went on to be one of the superstar designers and technical guys in Formula One. But back when I was test driver at a young age, I think it was some 21 years old or so, Paddy was a young engineer as well. And I don't think he had any heady heights of being where he ended up in the Formula One pit lane, the same as me as a Grand Prix driver.
I just want to go back a little bit. You're talking very briefly, you mentioned how you do way more miles back then you did than what test drivers do now. So are test drivers still like an asset to an F1 team today, or is that just kind of an add-on or an afterthought?
That's a good question. I don't believe that they have quite the same functionality as what they did back then. And I say that because, very often the case would be that we would be testing parts and developing the car while the Grand Prix guys were on the road. And, it'd be nothing for us to go out and test at Silverstone and be running around with a new wing, new underfloor, new suspension configuration, testing fuels, engine developments. And from our data and our, development and our understanding of what the car was doing in terms of its performance, we would then be able to send out those parts onto the Grand Prix team and they would fit them ready for that weekend for the Grand Prix drivers to use. So, very much a case of being hands-on. Today's world has been taken over slightly with technology, CFD and tunnel work and a lot of computer generated, strategies that are used and performance baselines. But from that, I think, the simulator role has taken on its own guise, but I still don't think that the simulator role gives a race team all of the insights into the workings of a driver. And, a racing driver is not just about driving a race car. He's about being the motivating force, a politician, a CEO, the finance director. He's really got to be able to pull that team around him and support all of the other channels as well. So, yeah, I think teams today miss out on test driver roles. I really do. I think it's something that should come back. And I think it also should come back because it will give teams more understanding and education on who their drivers are for the future and when they're ready to put into their car and get the job done. Because it's, you're looking at Formula One now where some drivers have been around for, 15, 16, 17, 18 years. And, I think there should be a natural process of the next generation coming through and making it a little bit more consistent. Not to say I want to see those guys. I still love watching a Kimi Raikkonen and I still like to see, the characters in the sport, but I think it's good to get young blood in as well.
Well, just to pivot a little bit, and you'll probably roll your eyes at the fact that, yet another interviewer is bringing this up with you, but I feel I have to ask. So why did you leave the Williams test seat in 1991 and effectively give your buddy Damon Hill a path to win the World Championship?
Well, hindsight's a wonderful thing, isn't it? So, and if I had a crystal ball, I'd have used it without doubt. It's very easy. At the end of the day, I was a young guy who'd got the opportunity with Williams, and I was holding a long-term contract. But in some ways, I was a victim of my own success because I'd done such a good job with Williams in testing. And again, because of doing all of those miles and because all the other teams were there testing alongside, you had lots of opportunity to show your performance and your ability, and you had lots of other teams looking at you to see that you were the real deal. And at that point, the Brabham team had been watching my performances, seeing my development role, and offered me a Grand Prix seat. Little did I know that actually it wasn't the right decision for me to take. But when you're a young guy with limited amount of guidance around you, being offered a Formula One seat and being paid as a professional racing driver, you know, you open your arms up and you take the opportunity. I should have had the foresight and the vision and the people around me to say, no, stay at Williams, because that really is where you're destined to continue being a Grand Prix driver. And I think the opportunity could have still been there for me to do so. But I took the first golden opportunity that was presented to me, and I ran with it. And in hindsight, it wasn't the right decision. And I look back now, and luckily it went to a very good friend of mine with Damon, my good buddies. And in fact, it was me that informed Damon and telephoned him to say, you need to get your backside down to Williams, because I've just left as test driver and there's a vacant seat there, which he did. But he went on and did one better. He went and won the World Championship with them. So, maybe some of my work helped him out to go and do that previously, but he won't admit that.
So as you're saying, in 1991, you ended up racing for Brabham in a subpar car, meant you really weren't able to score points. But then in 1992, you decided to sign a testing contract with McLaren. So why did you opt for a testing contract instead of a seat somewhere else where you could actually be competing?
Pretty much because of the reasons what I just said. Having made that decision, I knew very quickly that it was the wrong one, because the performance of the car wasn't there. And what underlined that to me is in the 1991 season, I was asked by Williams to return and go back and test their car for them, which was unheard of. You very rarely get a Grand Prix driver being contracted to one team and being asked by another team to go back and test their car. I jumped at the chance. Brabham were very happy to do it because they felt that it would have been good for them to have some insight into the latest, FW14B Williams, which is a Grand Prix winning car. But what it did is when I tested that Williams in the 91 season, I actually went around Imola 2.2 seconds faster on race tyres in the Williams than what I had done in Brabham on qualifying tyres the weekend just gone. And then the penny dropped that, I'd made a big decision and it was a bad one. And that then curtailed throughout the rest of the season in lack of performance. I did go on to score a point, the first point for Yamaha Motor Company and a World Championship point for Brabham. But I came to the end of the season knowing that it wasn't going to be a place for me to stay and I wouldn't be able to blossom and flourish. So again, I was approached by McLaren and I took the decision I'd rather test for the team of McLaren's performance levels and be a reserve driver for Ayrton Senna and Gerhard Berger than be in a Formula One car with Brabham, where I knew when I rolled down pit lane, the chances of scoring any points was minimal. And, I wasn't going to be able to progress my career. So that was a big decision I took. But I think actually for me at that stage, it was the right one.
As a driver from the good old days of F1, what do you think is currently wrong with the sport? And I realize that this is a loaded question, so feel free to be as general or specific as you like.
No, for me, it's very easy. What's wrong with the sport is that it's no longer motor racing. It's motor procession. So modern day F1 isn't what I feel it should be. For me, I want to see modern day gladiators combat at the wheel of a Formula One car side by side. Today, I don't get to see that, unfortunately. I get to see, strategic changes made that have an impact on the race result, or something fabricated with DRS being involved where an overtaking maneuver is done, in an artificial fashion. So you can shoot me down for saying it, but that's what I feel. And as a purist, I want to see cars And I think for racing drivers, that's what they're called, racing drivers, racing against each other, one-on-one combat, at the helm of high technology machinery to try and achieve that. So, yeah, that's the biggest issue for me. I wish F1 would be able to get to a point where, I watch a Formula 2 race and I find that has more racing involved than what an F1 race does. It shouldn't just be about pit stop strategy or tire strategy or anything else. It should be about racing cars going in side by side at 200 miles an hour and seeing who comes out the other end.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's been reflected by so many people, but how exactly do you think people people in Formula One should go about making those changes? Because the way I see it, there's kind of two sides or two ways that, Formula One can lean. Because, you mentioned Formula 2, that's a mostly spec series, right? So, you could argue that Formula One could start to move towards that a little bit. Cars are even, that leaves a little bit more room for drivers to fight with each other, right? But then there's also, the other thing that part of the reason why, big manufacturers like Mercedes or McLaren or, anyone enters a sport is they want the ability to be able to innovate and, do their own thing. They don't want to have to stick to spec, So, I mean, in the 90s, it seems like a time where people were innovating and you guys still had good racing. So why is that still not happening today?
Well, that just proves that it can be done because you had innovation and you had great amount of technology that was driven through the platforms of various teams, with the manufacturers then going on to use it in their cars several years later. But, there's much more cleverer people than me that can work this stuff out. But I think there's a balance. I think there's also a balance that the human input side should be there a little bit more. So, sometimes back in our generation, human input would be an error that was caused by making a gear shift wrong. And you would capitalize on that and you would make an overtaking maneuver. Today, a fouled gear shift would be recognized in, 20 milliseconds and would be rectified, and the gear shift would still happen in under a tenth of a second. And so nothing would happen on track to make the difference, because there's a backup system and then there's another system if that fails. That's just technology that's overtaken the human input. And the fact that we're probably looking at maybe like an 80-20 split of driver contribution towards performance of the car. So, I think that needs to be readdressed, and the balance of that taken slightly more towards a driver having more input, and at that point having the chance to make mistakes. There's enough people around much smarter than me to work it out, but trust me, it can be done. If we can do endurance racing and do a 6-hour race and people finish within a second of each other at the end of it, there's no reason why we can't do that over the Grand Prix distance of 2 hours max.
Do you feel that maybe teams have been kind of boxed in? Because I know like one thing, what was it, like the active suspension system, right? That was huge in the 90s. And then, a lot of that stuff, the FIA wanted to hold back on that. And, it kind of played a diminished role. So do you feel like now, I mean, I've read some books, from former engineers in Formula One, where they think the 90s were like the height of technology in Formula One. And then after that, it's just not really changed all that much. So do you feel like teams should be allowed to do that sort of thing and, keep advancing?
Well, I think the problem is like, you just touched on the subject where F1 is the pinnacle of technology and the cutting edge. What comes of that is cost, a fiscal contribution, and the costs keep going up and up and up and up. So again, it has to be addressed where, are we there for a technology platform or are we there for entertainment on Sunday afternoon? And my problem is, in today's world, especially, I come from a generation of having 3 channels on TV. You'll be in a generation where you've got 1,000 channels as well as all your streaming channels, and you're watching most things on a device. That's what Formula One is up against. The goalposts have moved and the people's choice is so big now. It's I'd be watching something on YouTube that I would never ever in my lifetime felt that I was going to watch a guy being up the side of a mountain on a 4-wheel drive vehicle that is extreme sport in a way. It just didn't exist, but now I can watch that and it's entertaining. So if F1 don't do something where it's going to be entertaining for 2 hours, then people are not going to engage. And that's the problem. And that's the thing that I worry about as a purist, that, you know, we're not getting to see. But I think that they know it's there, and I think they're addressing it for the future.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess you could argue with, things like Netflix series Drive to Survive. They're trying to reach out more to people in my age bracket and try to rectify that problem.
They are, with showing you behind the scenes and showing you the inner makings of what goes on within F1, maybe, but that still doesn't change what you see and watch on track.
Yeah, that's very fair.